This afternoon is a very important moment for all Australians and for the Church because it represents the great work of the Royal Commission in analysing the awful scourge of clerical sexual abuse, but it gives us a point from which and recommendations by which we'll be able to move forward. The Royal Commission has today released its final report, which includes more than 100 recommendations, many of which will have significant impact on the way the Catholic Church and others operate in Australia. I firstly want to acknowledge and thank Justice Peter McClellan, his fellow commissioners and all those who worked for and supported the Royal Commission over the past 5 years. They have facilitated a process which has provided an opportunity for thousands of survivors of childhood sexual abuse to tell their story. I think it's a real credit to the commissioners and to their staff that every survivor was treated with care and dignity. And I appeared before the Commission on 3 occasions. I found the commissioners to be friendly, forensic, but dedicated to the work of opening out this awful scourge so that we would all, as Australians, know what to do about it. They've undertaken a very important and necessary responsibility on behalf of the nation, and we hope that their efforts will ensure a much safer future for all our children. And the release of the final report today is the culmination of almost 5 years of intense examination of the way in which many different institutions, including the Catholic Church, have historically failed children. This is a shameful past in which a prevailing culture of secrecy and self-protection led to unnecessary suffering for many victims and their families. And once again, I reiterate on behalf of the Catholic bishops and religious leaders our unconditional apology for this suffering and a commitment to ensuring justice for those affected. Together with the religious orders across Australia, we're committed to continuing the work of recent years to ensure a future in which safety and protection of children and vulnerable adults is paramount. And we acknowledge the courage of all those survivors who've come forward to the Royal Commission. We'll be taking the Royal Commission's report and recommendations very seriously, and we've commissioned an initial assessment of its findings by the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, and we expect that assessment to be completed early in 2018. The Church will continue to push for the introduction of a national redress scheme for the survivors of child sexual abuse in which the Church will participate. And the success of this scheme lies with the cooperation of state governments, and without their involvement, national coverage will not be possible. It is now time for state governments and all of us to act. Central to this Royal Commission is the painful truth that so many children were abused, trust was destroyed and innocence lost. They are sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. This should never have happened. And as a bishop, I express my sorrow. The other night as I watched the documentary Undeniable, I saw time after time people with huge suffering whose lives were ruined and who were not listened to, while leaders and others just looked the other way. Not only is that not good enough, it's seriously wrong and criminal. So as a bishop, I humbly apologise and I commit the Church to walking forward with the community, with the victims and survivors into a new future where child sexual abuse will be a thing that doesn't exist in our community, and we are committed to heightening in our parishes and communities the importance of being aware and proactive in the steps we know now that we must take. Thank you.
Thanks, Your Grace. I'll open it up to questions. Who'd like to start? I'll just ask you to use this microphone, if that's okay, and just point it quite directly so you get picked up.
One of the recommendations made in the report was about the use of confessionals, and that the Catholic Church hasn't clarified its position on whether someone who is a perpetrator of child sexual abuse can be absolved if they admit that in a confessional.
I'd like to say 2 things. Firstly, the seal of the confessional, or the relationship with God that's carried through the priest and with the person, is inviolable. It can't be broken. And the Cardinal Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, mentioned that and notified the bishops even as recently as last month. Prior to that, as many of you know, after the Royal Commission, one of our bishops asked about the extent of that seal and what it included, and I inquired in Rome in October as to what that would be, and they said that this matter was still being seriously considered and they would get back to us. In practical terms, I've been a priest for 50 years. I've never heard anything like that. I would certainly insist that if a person came to me and confessed those heinous crimes, I would refuse them absolution until they went to the authorities. Or if a child came to me and said that they were molested, I would see that the conversation moved outside the confessional so that I could take them to a parent or teacher to see that that was reported. So there's no standing back. While we have the sacredness of the confessional, there's no standing back in practical terms on the part of the Church.
But will the canon law be changed to change?
I don't expect that it will be changed, but we are committed to doing whatever we possibly can, because this has to be a top priority. No more child sexual abuse anywhere in the world.
Just to clarify on that. Just to clarify on that point, though, so you say that you will refuse them absolution.
Yes.
But how important is it that priests report child abuse? Would you report
I would want.
abuse if
I couldn't report the abuse from what I heard in the confessional, but I would be trying to do everything I could to get the person outside and say, hey, what you're doing is really serious and criminal, and for the good of society and for your own good, we've got to go to the authorities. So I would be very strong on that.
So that's a recommendation, because that's pretty explicit in the report. That's a recommendation you won't comply with, or you won't follow?
I will have to follow what the Church lays down on me, but that being said, I would want, with every fibre of my being, to make sure that those things were reported.
Another recommendation is that compulsory celibacy. It mentioned that's a contributing factor to abuse. Do you agree with that statement? And
I
is
think
this something
that
you'll go to the Holy See and say that they should consider removing this compulsory celibacy?
I think it's very important for us to realise that the Catholic Church in Australia will receive the recommendations of the Royal Commission very, very seriously. And that recommendation isn't my competency to change, but I certainly will see that the bishops pass on that recommendation to the Holy See, and they will then decide. I believe that there are real values in celibacy where it is walking with a group, every people, and with others as Christ does, and that being supported by prayer and by a relationship which is broader than a relationship of marriage, and that's living as Jesus did. But it's a difficult thing. It's a point I think as the Commission made that not everyone can live up to, and we have to be sure in our training and introduction of young people for the priesthood that they understand what they're taking on, and if they can't be really motivated, really sure and really helped, then it's better that they not go forward.
Just going back to the confessional, just to be clear, if the law of the land says that a priest who hears a confession of child sexual abuse must report that to police, would you defy that law?
My sacred charge is to respect the seal of the confessional, but I would say, from what I've heard over 50 years, not only in confessions but elsewhere among priests, that it's almost non-existent. I think the only kind of situation where a priest who's offended might go to confession might be to an accomplice, another pedophile. So it's, for that extent, it's not as practical a question.
So for you, the seal of confession is more important than the law of the land?
I revere the law of the land and I trust it, but this is a sacred spiritual charge before God which I must honour, and I have to try and do what I can do with both.
Just on the recommendations about Catholic schools, I think the report says that the model where Catholic parish priests are the employers of principals and teachers is dysfunctional and should be changed. Will you change that in Victoria and in other states that have that similar rules?
I know that in many places around Australia the employment is more centralised and it's not done by the parish priest. While there might be certain pastoral advantages in relation to people in the school, I think this is a serious recommendation and I would certainly have to look at it with my people.
But do you think it's worthwhile? You say it's a serious one, but do you think it's a worthwhile recommendation? I think Victoria's out of step.
Others are doing it the other way. I think I've got to look at it.
Well, you go next.
No, you go.
Just give us a moment. Would you like a bit of water, you Grace?
Thank you.
Okay.
Just back to the confessional issue, the matter of when children go to confession, I think one of the recommendations was around ensuring it occurred in a more open environment within the line of sight of another adult. Is that something that you would, take on board?
Here in Melbourne, I've already enacted that, and I've directed that in all our school children's confessions that it be in an open setting with privacy by way of distance, but certainly while a teacher's there who has the responsibility of supervision and can see what's happening, so there's no danger of anything inappropriate.
And one other question from me. The Royal Commission recommended the participation of lay people in the appointment of bishops and individuals to seminaries. Would you push for greater level of involvement of lay people?
There is involvement of lay people and consultation already. However, I think right across the board in the church, it's a matter of recognising and using the talents which people have, and whether it's in the assessment by the church of who are suitable to be leaders, or whether it's to help the leaders of the church, the bishops, the leaders of congregations. It's most important that we have women and men of a broad range so that the advice given is of a broad range and we don't have any repetition of individual bishops or leaders making ill-informed decisions.
And just quickly, these recommendations, a lot of them, it seems like the government or the Commission doesn't really have power to enact the change. They're relying on the church. Do you think there might be some resistance within the church that a lot of these recommendations potentially overreach?
Look, it's early days and I think we have to study the recommendations. I know there are a number of recommendations which relate to the life of the universal church and recommendations that the bishops pass on to Rome, matters of law or matters of discipline. We'll certainly do that as the considered view of the Commission, which comes from a very serious consideration of the whole question of criminal sexual abuse. So we will commit ourselves to that.
I'm not too sure whether this has been dealt with, but will the church establish an entity, a separate entity, to allow victims to sue? Because my understanding, they can't sue the church.
My understanding is that we've already been encouraged to establish in each diocese and each religious order an appropriate entity to sue, and we have done that here in Melbourne. So I think that matter is underway so that if people enter into litigation, there is an entity to sue so that the litigation can be conducted fairly and in an appropriate manner.
Would there be a cap on that at all? And how much who would determine the payment?
If you go into litigation, it's a matter for the law to determine according to the principles of law, and I would not expect that there would be a cap.
Would you expect a lot of cases now to come forward?
Already, we've had, since 1996, the use of the Melbourne response to try and help victims to be supported. Recently, late last year, we doubled the compensation that we were offering from 75,000 to 150,000, which was what was recommended by the Commonwealth Government. And in that time, since last year, 200 people have come forward for a top-up, and an extra 10 million has been paid from Melbourne Diocese. This indicates to me that there will be various approaches, and obviously Survivors have to be free to choose whatever approach suits them, and I've got to respect that.
Do you think the Commission has damaged the credibility of the Catholic Church around Australia, but in particular in Victoria?
I don't think the Commission has damaged the credibility of the Church. If you were to ask me what is the position of the Church now, I would say that we are diminished because our people are sad at what has happened. Many are angry at the betrayal of the trust that should have been able to be given to leaders and to priests and so on. So I think the situation is changed. We have a lot of ground to recover, and in recovering that ground, we have to show, not only in the area of child protection, but in other areas, that we are walking forward with our society, that we are a humble church, recognising that we're a church of sinners, but we're also a church that will work forward in the areas which are so important. And among the most important of those is the whole question of eradicating child sexual abuse.
It just sounds like it's hard for your average Australian to understand when you say that it's up to the Holy See and about reforming so many things within the Catholic Church, that the priority isn't just changing whatever needs to be done immediately to protect children. Even a lot of Christians would have a hard time with the idea that in a confessional you'd be prioritising that process over immediately reporting child abuse. Do you
We want to do the immediate reporting. It's only in the matters which are part of the discipline of the Universal Church that we are restricted. And I think that would be a tiny, tiny occasion. And as I've explained, I would certainly be moving to make sure that we got that situation out of the confessional, or to really progress the reporting. You know, these things must be reported, the appropriate action must be taken, there must be messages given to our community. Just in the Archdiocese of Melbourne, we've given in servicing this year to 1,600 people in parishes, in committees, so that they know what to look out for and what's expected when we're caring for children.
Just a couple of questions. Just on celibacy, I think you spoke about it briefly before, but do you acknowledge, as the Commission found, that compulsory celibacy has contributed to the occurrence of child sexual abuse?
I'd make a little distinction that some undertake celibacy without a proper understanding or without proper capacity. It's our job to make sure that if people take on celibacy, they understand it and can follow it. In the Universal Church, in the Eastern Church, priests are allowed to marry. We have some priests who have come as married men from Anglicanism who are allowed to remain married. So that's a disciplinary matter for the Church, and I think the factors that the Royal Commission recommends can be put to the Holy See to help them in their consideration of that matter.
Just a reflection on one of your predecessors, Frank Little. I think we haven't heard from you since the report came out last week. What are your thoughts on his conduct? And it might be symbolic, but perhaps I think he's a sir or a knight under the Church. Would that be revoked?
I think in my evidence at the Royal Commission, I indicated clearly, and I think the Commission recognised that there were serious failures, secrecy, lack of action and so on, and I can't deny that. The Sir part, of course, is from Queen Elizabeth, so I can't do anything about that.
Okay, I guess many people are wondering why it's taken a Royal Commission to reveal the extent of the abuse and come up with all these recommendations. Haven't you and your fellow bishops been negligent in not investigating and then coming up with ways to fixing it? I'm talking about the bishops on your board now.
I've only been a bishop since 1997, so I really came in at a time when the Melbourne Response and Towards Healing existed, and there was an increasing awareness, and there was the removal of priests from ministry who had offended. So in one sense, the work had already commenced. And that's true of those who've been my auxiliary bishops now, Archbishop Coleridge in Brisbane, Archbishop Prowse in Canberra, Archbishop Costello in Perth, and then my auxiliary bishops. So in that sense, we've really been at the forefront of trying to do the right thing.
But with respect, that was 20 years ago, and that was Towards Healing in Melbourne response, so essentially compensation schemes or assistance schemes for victims. There's been no investigation into that I know from the church that's been reported, and no recommendations similar to these of a Royal Commission. Why haven't you investigated as thoroughly as the Royal Commission and come up with recommendations early in the 20 years that you've been in charge?
We did have a review of the Melbourne response done by Justice Donald Ryan, and it was the result of that the compensation was changed.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not talking about Melbourne response. I'm talking about investigating, the sort of investigating that the Royal Commission has done to find out the extent of abuse and things and recommendations that needed to fix it. How come the church and you and your fellow bishops haven't undertaken those investigations, and it's taken a Royal Commission to actually do it?
I think it has taken time for bishops to realise the seriousness of the matter, and others would say that the idea of an organisation investigating itself, I'm not making that as an excuse, but the idea of an organisation investigating itself.
You could have turned it over to a independent investigator.
Well, we could, but I think we progressed along. I became Archbishop in 2001, and already we were looking at what might be done. Pope Benedict, when he became the Pope in 2005, lifted up the administrative procedure by which fellows could be removed from the priesthood, and I certainly followed out on that pretty promptly by 2010. So it can't be true that we've done nothing. I certainly admit we could and should have done more. I'm grateful to the Royal Commission because I don't think we could have done it in the forensic, objective way right across the community that this terrible evil demands.
And just a personal reflection from you, I guess, looking back, do you admit to any failings in the way you've dealt with survivors and claimants, and what have you learnt over this Royal Commission period? I
think it's been a slow learning curve. We've tried to deal fairly with complainants. I think what we've done more recently, particularly with the survivors, is the renewal of our counselling service. Our counselling service, unique in Australia, goes from now to as long as people need it, and it's a client-based service looking at the needs of the particular client, and we're finding that it's been upgraded. There's more staff, there's more awareness to help people, and that help is bearing fruit in the help and the I use the word thanks that clients are telling us about in recent years. So that's one thing.
I was just asking about your own personal reflections.
My own personal reflection is that we could have done greater things more quickly, but moving along little by little, I think the Royal Commission has been the stimulus. We haven't done it as quickly as we might. In 2010, I wrote to every priest who'd been off the mission and wanted to try and get them out of the priesthood. There are steps that have been going on all the time.
Given that you admit that you acted too slowly and it's taken too long to do this, would it be the right thing to do for some of you on that council to step aside and allow some new people to come in, people who might have taken action a bit faster?
I think the important thing at this stage is not necessarily to consider resignations, but it is to consider what steps need to be made now and to make sure that we learn from the slowness of the past so that we really get on with it. And I think that's the challenge, and thank you for putting it to me.
That's true, though. Someone needs to come and make some decisions, but if people like yourself have admitted they've been too slow, isn't it time for other people to come in and actually make these changes?
I don't necessarily agree with that, provided that I'm prepared to learn from what's gone on in the past.
Water break, redress.
Water.
Sorry, to go back to the confessional recommendation, You say that the seal of confession can't be broken, but what if, just hypothetically, you could save some people from abuse by breaking that seal in particular circumstances after all that's happened, after all that's come out in the Royal Commission?
I would feel terribly conflicted, and I would try even harder to get that person outside confessional, but I cannot break the seal. The penalty for any priest breaking the seal is excommunication, being cast out of the church. So it's a real serious spiritual matter, and I want to observe the law of the land, and I want to do everything I can to end this awful scourge, and I'm committed to that.
Just on that though, you'd rather risk, or rather not be excommunicated from the church, rather than have one extra child abused. So if an extra child was abused as a result of your decision, that's a terrible proposition.
I know it's a terrible proposition. I admit the proposition. I would say to you though, it's a very, very long bow that anyone would come to me to confession. It's not an excuse.
I think
but
there was evidence.
As part of my identity as a priest, I have to observe the seal of the confession, and that applies to all priests.
And it does sound like it's a very rare occurrence, but I think there was evidence to the Commission, correct me if I'm wrong, that has happened. Is that your understanding?
I think there was one matter mentioned, but I still go back to the fact that in 50 years in which I've been a priest, I've never heard of anything like that, and I've never heard another priest mentioning anything like that.
Just on the fact that of the proportion of survivors, 61% were abused in the Catholic Church. Just wanted to know what your thoughts were and responses to that, huge proportion of abuse that was actually happening in the Catholic Church.
That for me, of course, is a cause of great shame. While we can bring out all sorts of statistics that we had a lot of people in residential care and it's because of this, that and the other thing, my position constantly is that if there is one person abused, that's one too many. So I'm ashamed of that, and I apologise once again to those whose lives are ruined. I've met with survivors, and the extent to which they struggle and the extent to which their lives are burdened is really terrible.
And just quickly, on the national redress scheme, any idea on how much money the church would be willing to put into that if it does get up and running?
My understanding is that with the national redress scheme, there will be an award for a particular victim. There'll be an amount for the church, and there'll be an administration figure. And therefore, it's not a question of the church tipping in a whole lot of money, but it being done on a case-by-case basis. And certainly we are committed to being part of the national redress scheme, if at all possible.
We might nearly finish. I think the questions look like they're drying up. No, we'll take one. We haven't had one from over there. Excuse me.
Thank you. Archbishop, Mark Dreyfus, the Opposition Attorney General, this morning said on radio that he was disappointed that no one from the Catholic Church or no official representative was at the final hearing yesterday. Can you explain why?
Certainly.
There was no representative?
The Truth, Justice and Healing Council are our body who have been interacting with the Royal Commission all the way along. And Francis Sullivan, the Chief Executive, whom you may have seen on ABC 7:30 or heard on the radio this morning, he went there as our official representative. Looking back, I'm sorry that we didn't have another representative, but that was just the way it turned out, I think.
And in terms of the Holy See, can you explain how this Royal Commission has been regarded?
Yes, I can certainly explain.
How seriously it's being taken?
It's being very seriously regarded. On the 5th of October, I was invited with Archbishop Coleridge of Brisbane to go to a meeting with the Holy See, and it was attended by Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, Archbishop Paul Gallagher, who was the nuncio here and is now the Foreign Minister, the Chair of the Congregation for Bishops, Cardinal Willett, the Secretary of the Congregation for Doctrine, and they wanted to hear what I've told you a little bit today about the church and how things are, what steps we've taken, for example, establishing Catholic Professional Standards Limited, what we're doing in child protection education, what we're doing to try and create a safe environment, how we've tried to be more responsible in our response to redress. And then we also explained what a Royal Commission is, but we did ask that there be a linkage established with the Holy See so that they could move more closely together with us. And there is a point of contact now within the Secretariat of State from which we can feed the information here, the decisions, I'm sure the recommendations of the Royal Commission straight away, so that the Holy See will know what is proposed and will be able to consider it. So I think that represents a great step forward. They were very much understanding of the evil of sexual abuse, very much understanding of the way in which the Church needs to act humbly and sincerely, the way in which the Church, as not merely bishops and priests and religious, but as the lay people, all of the people of the Church, needs to reshape our path and to move forward together. So that was a worthwhile meeting, and we were received with sympathy.